never gave any public statement about vaccines. You cannot find a single Samoan who will say, I didn't get a vaccine because of Bobby Kennedy.
After that interview, there's no way I'd hire Mr. Kennedy to be Secretary of Health and Human Services.
We also want to thank President Trump for the promises he made to us. He said he would secure our borders and that he would never forget about Laken.
We tend to take various constituent groups for granted because we get comfortable.
Hello, I'm Robert Costa in Washington. Tonight on America Decides, a high-stakes hearing. The president's nominee to run Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., on Capitol Hill today. As Republicans heap praise, Democrats are working to pick apart his views on everything from vaccines to abortion.
It's time to make sure that we blow the whistle on actually what your views are.
News reports have claimed that I'm anti-vaccine or anti-industry. I am neither.
Your commitment to combating chronic conditions that drive healthcare costs will be critical to our success.
Plus, funding freeze unfrozen? The White House now seeming to recalibrate its order to pause all funding on federal grants and loans. But what does that mean for those organizations relying on that money? And 2 million federal workers now get an offer, quit now, and get a severance package through the end of September. But is the president's latest move legal? Some Democrats say otherwise.
The president has no authority to make that offer. You were here before he was here, and you'll be here after he was here.
Let's start, though, tonight with CBS News congressional correspondent Nicole Killian and CBS News White House reporter Olivia Rinaldi. Great to have both of you here. Nicole, let's begin with you. Where does the White House stand on Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and his performance today?
Well, I think for the most part, they feel pretty good about it. Obviously, there were a number of Senate Republicans who felt that they are now willing to support him, or that he put the vaccine issue to bed, if you will, although many Democrats certainly feel to the contrary. And we saw many of them spar with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. over some of his past statements and views surrounding vaccines. But that being said, of course, this was the first of two hearings that we saw today in the Senate Finance Committee. Of course, Kennedy will be before the Senate Health Committee tomorrow, although Finance will be the one that decides whether or not his nomination should advance. Take a listen to some of the exchanges that took place earlier today during the hearing.
It's time to make sure that we blow the whistle on actually what your views are. At least we're starting.
We need to move on.
I support the measles vaccine. I support the polio vaccine. I will do nothing as HHS secretary that makes it difficult or discourages people from taking either of those
Anybody
vaccines.
who believes that ought to look at the measles book you wrote saying parents have been misled into believing that measles is a deadly disease. That's not true.
So again, kind of when he was pushed on the issue, that's when we heard Kennedy kind of come forward expressing support, as you heard there, for things like the polio vaccine and the vaccine for measles. Of course, when he was on the Hill a couple of weeks back, he kind of mouthed something to reporters saying that he was in support of the polio vaccine. That was at a time where he came under a heavy criticism from Mitch McConnell, who, of course, is a polio survivor, saying, you know, any type of effort to discount vaccines like that certainly won't get you anywhere here in the Senate. I'm obviously paraphrasing McConnell's words there, but again, this was kind of really the first time we've heard him give a more full-throated defense of some of these vaccines. But that being said, as I mentioned, some Democrats still not buying it, feeling that he's only putting forth these views now to secure his confirmation.
Let's listen to what Robert F. Kennedy Jr. had to say on another issue, abortion.
So, Mr. Kennedy, I'm confused. You have clearly stated in the past that bodily autonomy is one of your core values. The question is, do you stand for that value or not? When was it that you decided to sell out the values you've had your whole life in order to be given power by President Trump?
Senator, I agree with President Trump that every abortion is a tragedy, that we can't be a moral authority in this country.
Right.
Olivia, great to have you here as well. The president's coalition is built in part on support from opponents of abortion rights in the conservative movement and the Republican Party. Former Vice President Mike Pence has opposed Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s nomination on the grounds of the abortion issue. He is opposed to abortion rights. So how is the White House, when you're talking to people there behind the scenes, looking at how this issue could affect his Republican support.
Well, it was one of the few things today that were called into question about his flip-flopping views. A lot of people questioning Robert F. Kennedy for being a pro-choice Democrat earlier in this cycle. That's what he ran as, and now he is aligned politically, he says, with President Trump on the issue of abortion, saying that he is selected by Trump to run the Health and Human Services as the secretary there, and therefore it's his job to carry out Trump's will. He goes on to say in the rest of that quote that he believes we can't be a moral nation if we're allowing 1.2 million abortions to happen in this country. And also, as you point out, interestingly enough, it's the one issue that former Vice President Mike Pence is willing to come out and speak on and criticize Trump and his administration about, that he doesn't believe that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. really represents where the party is, where MAGA is. But White House officials are not exactly too concerned about that. Remember, Trump himself on abortion has had a long history on his own stances from 1980, where he said he was pro-choice, to now where he says he believes it should be left up to the states. And of course, he implemented those Supreme Court justices who ultimately overturned Roe versus Wade. So important to note that even though Trump has really gotten that Christian vote, he's gotten the evangelicals on his side. His Health and Human Services director says he's in line with him, but both of their histories suggest that perhaps this isn't the top priority for them.
Let's turn to the issue of immigration. Today, President Trump signed into law the Laken Riley Act. Let's take a listen.
This is a very important law. This is something that has brought Democrats and Republicans together. That's not easy to do. Laken did it. Laken did it. America will never, ever forget Laken Hope Riley.
Nicole, back to you on this issue. We saw some bipartisan support for this legislation. Do you believe that this is going to continue on Capitol Hill, or are Democrats now expressing a lot of criticism and reluctance in the wake of the mass deportations that are playing out across the country?
Yeah, I think the short answer is a hard no, Bob. I mean, obviously, we saw some Democrats support the Laken Riley Act even in the last Congress. But of course, it was Leader Chuck Schumer who didn't bring it up to the floor here in the Senate. But of course, now that you have Republican majorities in both chambers, that's why we saw it clear both the Senate and the House. And of course, becoming the first bill that President Trump has signed into law. Now, keep in mind the Democrats have expressed a willingness to work with Republicans, particularly on the issue of border security and immigration. But as you very well know, Bob, of course, while this is a top priority of President Trump, Republicans have made clear that they intend to fold a large chunk of that legislative policy into whatever big reconciliation package they put together. So that is likely to have to advance without much Democratic support, even though some Democrats have tried to reach out to work across the aisle, whether that may be on separate legislation, but knowing that Republicans really want to prioritize that reconciliation bill, it seems any chance to work across the aisle may be few and far between.
And Olivia, when you look at the White House handling today this issue of the federal freeze, what are you hearing? There's a lot of confusion, even in the press corps, about what exactly is going on with this executive order. What's the latest you can share about how the administration's handling its proposal on federal funding across the board?
Yeah, quite a confusing day here at the White House on what this exactly meant. Let me just walk you through what happened today and what we heard. First, we heard from the acting director of the Office of Management and Budget, who told federal agencies in a memo that the freezing of aid had been rescinded. Then we heard from Caroline Leavitt, she's the White House press secretary, who wrote in a statement that this is not a rescission of the federal funding freeze, but Trump's executive orders on federal funding will remain in full force and effect. Essentially, what has happened is that Trump's executive orders that he signed last week about the federal about making sure that all federal agencies are in line with his priorities and his objectives related to DEI, related to his priorities on slimming down federal government. All of those that he signed last week were then directed through OMB through a memo out to these agencies, asking them to pause any of that federal funding so they could review all of these policies. What got rescinded today was the OMB memo, not the federal or rather not the executive orders, but just the memo. So a little bit of a distinction there, but it was enough to cause a lot of chaos here at the White House, people questioning what this meant. But ultimately, that federal funding is still on pause until we are hearing from a federal judge in this case who put a stay on that order that we will hear from on Monday, whether or not this federal funding freeze will be lifted, whether it will stay in place. Still a lot of questions tonight on what exactly this all means. But Trump himself saying that the reason why they're doing this federal funding is, one, to make sure that all of these programs are lined up with his priorities, but two, to stop the wasteful spending of government. So that's what we're hearing from White House officials tonight. That's what they're focused on.
Olivia Rinaldi and Nicole Killian, thank you. We appreciate you stopping by. It was a tragedy that killed 83 people, mostly babies and children, the measles outbreak on a remote Pacific island, and why Hawaii's governor is blaming Robert F. Kennedy Jr. for that tragedy. Governor Josh Green joins us here on set, coming up next on America Decides.
I want to make sure the committee is clear about a few things. News reports have claimed that I'm anti-vaccine or anti-industry. I am neither. I am pro-safety.
A contentious hearing today. The president's pick to lead Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., making his case on Capitol Hill. But as lawmakers consider his nomination, Hawaii's Democratic governor, Josh Green, has a message for them, arguing that his confirmation, Kennedy's confirmation, in his view, could have deadly consequences. Governor Josh Green is here on set with us now. Governor, thanks for being here. Let's play a clip of Carolyn Kennedy, the daughter of President John F. Kennedy, speaking about Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Bobby is addicted to attention and power. Bobby preys on the desperation of parents of sick children, vaccinating his own kids while building a following hypocritically discouraging other parents from vaccinating theirs.
So, Governor, you have a member of the Kennedy family, an esteemed ambassador, daughter of a president, criticizing Robert F. Kennedy Jr. You have Democratic senators today doing the same. You had Robert F. Kennedy Jr., though, saying today that he is not anti-vaccine. He was making different statements throughout his testimony today about how he couches his position in terms of mandates for vaccines and how his position, in his view, is a bit varied when it comes to the exact nature of how he looks at this issue. As someone who governs a state, someone who has to deal with real-world problems, real-world health issues, what did you make of his testimony today?
It was nonsense. I mean, I don't want to be too cruel. I respect the person and the family, but I've had interactions, kind of cross paths with RFK Jr., and it's not true. First of all, I'm a physician, okay? I'm the only physician that's a governor. And what happened in Samoa was relevant. There's 40,000 Samoans that live in Hawaii. That nation is close to Hawaii. They had the measles outbreak 5 years ago. He rolled through that nation and scared them, discouraged them, talked to their prime minister. I know that because I went in to clean up the mess. I took the medical mission into Samoa, 75 doctors and nurses, and we vaccinated 37,000 people after there had been many deaths, ultimately 83 deaths. And he did scare them. They told me personally that he basically had come in and wanted to do this kind of experiment to see what would happen naturally if you just let this virus, and measles virus is very contagious, roll through. And you also had 5,000 people get sick, and they get encephalopathy, which is swelling of the brain. They can get blindness or deafness from the virus. So he did that. And then he came and told the Congress, no, I'm not anti-vax. Well, he is. He founded an organization that is anti-vax. He got paid millions of dollars by that organization to, kind of go and spin that gospel. So he may not be specifically telling people don't get this vaccine, but he's sowing doubt. And when you sow doubt, the vaccine rates drop, and then you get lots of spread because you don't have herd immunity. That's what he did in Samoa. So that was a dishonest hearing. I don't know what to tell you. People in Washington seem to play the partisan thing, but this is going to kill kids.
Let's listen to what Robert F. Kennedy Jr. had to say to our CBS colleague, Major Garrett, in the past year on this issue.
I had nothing to do with it. And if you actually looked at what happened in Samoa, the people who died were dying not from measles, but almost certainly from a defective vaccine that was brought in from Australia and then given to children who were already sick, which you should never do.
That was right before he dropped out of the presidential race. What's your response to how he's approaching this?
Well, he's not taking any responsibility. We have footage from his own feeds, his own social media, from other people's feeds, that he was there, yucking it up, smiling, laughing with the prime minister. He did do that. He did go in there and discourage people. And it just takes a nudge for people who are vaccine hesitant. And then he spread misinformation. What really happened? What really happened was 2 children died because they were given the wrong reagent, which was a tragedy, human error. Those 2 nurses were prosecuted and sentenced. Then he went in and told people, and he said it again, by the way, today in the hearing. I hope you'll be able to roll footage in the coming days. He said today, the measles vaccine killed those 2 children. That's not true. The measles reagent killed them. The vaccine was fine. And then we used these vaccines to vaccinate 37,000 people in 2 days, and the measles stopped. So he's telling lie after lie, misinformation after misinformation. And this is the person who, with no experience, no training, will be in charge of the Health and Human Services Department, which is huge, $1.7 trillion.
So his nomination is still very much to be determined. But let's say Mr. Kennedy is confirmed by this Republican-controlled Senate. Will you work with HHS and a potential Secretary Kennedy on policy?
Well, I'm going to vaccinate people. I had to deal with that, of course, in the last administration when people were allowing misinformation about the COVID vaccine, and I had to continuously press for the vaccine. Of course, I will work with everyone. I actually worked at HHS. I was a National Health Service Corps scholar, a physician that was sent to Hawaii to provide health care. So, of course, I will work with anybody, but it's not good to nominate people that have no experience in their discipline, and it's not good to put someone in there who will, misrepresent. This is a guy who's getting paid, and everyone knows it. Everyone knows it, to thwart vaccination programs. He admitted it today that he was paid by these guys and still wants to get paid. We have all the footage. So I don't know how anyone with a straight face could say it. He created an organization called the Children's Health Defense, which is a pure anti-vax group. They're selling onesies, as Bernie pointed out, that says, don't vaccinate me or something. This is an organization he founded. So has the world gone mad that we are going to suggest that this guy is actually okay with vaccinations? He will again place doubt into the field, and then we will see outbreaks.
Finally here, Governor, the Democratic Party, your party, in the political wilderness, not controlling the House, the Senate, or the White House. Jimmy Carter, former president of the United States, an outsider, came out of nowhere in 1976. A lot of people in Washington are wondering, come 2028, could it be another outsider who emerges this time around, decades later, to give the Democratic Party a new voice? You're a physician, a governor, someone who's probably as far away as you can get from Washington, D.C., though maybe the Alaskan governor would have a bit of an argument there as well.
Yes.
Are you considering at all a presidential conversation for yourself in the coming years?
I mean, that's incredibly flattering. I'm proud to be a doctor and a governor. It seems highly unlikely. I'm going to be governor through 26, and if the people will have me through 2030, you'd have to really convince my wife, frankly, to do anything like that. But I will always help the people here in D.C., and you never know how the world will turn. But I really am honored to be governor of Hawaii because geopolitically, we're actually a lot more central to what the nation does. We handle the Pacific region. We will deal with what comes out of Taiwan and China's conflicts. And as you can see, everyone loves Hawaii. We've even had to deal with some of the largest crises, and we're helping people that are in other states that are dealing with wildfires now and so on. So, look, it's an honor that you would say something like that. But
well, you're a governor of a key state that has to deal with a lot of different issues. It's not trying to honor you in any way, but this is a party that clearly has no evident standard bearer at this point. Well, and you're a sitting governor in a party that doesn't have many sitting governors.
What I'll do is I will help us lead, and I'll help the whole country lead. I'm afforded a really special honor, which is that it's very nonpartisan for me as the governor of Hawaii. So a lot of Democrats support me, and a ton of Republicans have been supportive. I try to damp down the division, and I'd like to do that for the country. Right now, as a governor with the other governors, we have a governors association, and I really like to create bonds there. So one never knows, but I'm happy to be governor.
Governor Josh Green of Hawaii, we really appreciate you taking the time. Thanks for coming by CBS News. Former New Jersey Senator Bob Menendez sentenced for taking cash from Mercedes and gold bars as bribes. We've got details on how long he could serve behind bars. You're watching America Decides. A judge has sentenced former New Jersey Senator Bob Menendez to 11 years in prison. Today's sentencing comes several months after a jury convicted Menendez on 16 felony counts, including bribery, extortion, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. He was also found guilty of acting as a foreign agent for the government of Egypt. The former lawmaker slammed the court while delivering remarks to reporters.
Welcome to the Southern District of New York, the Wild West of political prosecutions. President Trump is right. This process is political and it's corrupted to the core.
Senator Menendez quoting President Trump. He will not report to jail until June 6th so he can attend his wife's bribery trial. That's scheduled to start in March. CBS News reporter Katrina Kaufman joins us now. Katrina, great to see you. What's the reaction up in New York in the courtroom, in the courtroom defending today's sentencing?
Bob, it's great to join you. During the sentencing, Menendez stood there just very silently looking at the judge, his hands clasped, and his children, Rob and Alicia, were right behind him. But what I think was even more striking is the contrast of the way Menendez acted in the courtroom today versus that clip that you played outside of the courtroom, Bob, because Menendez spoke on his own behalf in court to the judge, which is the right of a criminal defendant during a sentencing, and he really got quite emotional. He broke down crying to the judge. He called himself a chastened man. He said that the judge hadn't gotten to know who he truly was and told stories about his many years of service, his rise in politics, how he had helped save lives over the years. But when he came outside, he really had no contrition. He proclaimed his innocence. And as you were just saying, he was quoting President Trump, really just talking about the injustice of the New York political system.
Katrina, prosecutors were calling for Senator Menendez to serve 15 years while the defense team was arguing he should serve just about 2 or less than that. Why did the judge ultimately sentence him to 11 years?
Bob, the judge said that he decided to sentence Menendez below what the guidelines said because of a few factors. One is his age. He's 71 years old. Also his health and his decades of public service. But the judge also felt that he really had to show deterrence here, a general deterrence. He didn't think that Menendez is going to commit this type of crime again, but he had to show the public that you just can't violate the public oath in this way. You can't have bribery and fraud and a betrayal of the voters in the government.
Katrina Kaufman, great reporter, always on top of all the legal happenings in New York. They seem to never end. Katrina, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Bob.
President Trump signs his first piece of legislation, as we discussed, into law. Our political panel will take a look at that immigration bill that gained some bipartisan support in recent months. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. There's a lot going on in Washington, including President Trump signing into law the Laken Riley Act. There's the Democratic National Committee that's coming up with its vote for its new chair. And you have so much going on Capitol Hill with these nominations. Here to discuss it all, Maura Gillespie, who advised former Speaker John Boehner and former Congressman Adam Kinzinger, and Jaime Moore. He's the former director of the Office for the Democratic National Committee Chair. Great to be here with both of you. Let's begin, though, with Governor Josh Green was just in your chairs here a moment ago, from Democrat from Hawaii, very sharply critical of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. The question I have for both of you, and we'll begin with Maura, is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. had a different kind of coalition. He had Democrats who were anti-establishment backing him in his initial bid against President Biden. Then he became supportive of President Trump. If you're a Republican or Democrat who's more traditional, shall we say, in your politics, and you're prepared to oppose Robert F. Kennedy Jr., do you pay a political price in this scrambled political age we're living in, or is it just kind of politics as normal these days?
Well, I think the case with RFK Jr. makes it interesting because it's about whether you're going to make a stance on which issue. You know, we saw it play out today with Elizabeth Warren going after RFK Jr.'s stances on a myriad of things, but then you had other Democrats who were going after her about abortion, and I think like things like that don't really resonate as far as some of the other concerns about vaccines. So the messages that came from the Democratic side seemed pretty disjointed, whereas there are real concerns on the Republican side as well on the issues of abortion, but also on how to handle some of the controversial things he said about Medicare, Medicaid, and how he would address those issues. But I think that by and large, Americans are appreciative of knowing, we do need more transparency. And I think that is what he is offering. And as Republicans, we want less government oversight, but more transparency. So the messaging there, I think that RFK Jr. is presenting is something that would be welcomed in that regards. But there are plenty of things that they could have hit on that didn't seem as streamlined as they could have made it.
So we hear so much about vaccines, but what about the character issue, Jaime? You look at Carolyn Kennedy, we played her earlier in the show, criticizing Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on conduct grounds and on the vaccine grounds as well, but saying he's a predator. For Democratic senators, top Democrats in Congress that are they looking at that issue as well?
Well, I think it's a slippery slope. You got to be very careful when you look at those type of issues. We just did this with Pete Hegseth, who's now the secretary, a few weeks ago. So I think here's the greater problem for Democrats. I think Democrats are having a hard time figuring out what is their premise of opposition. You have a new Congress, a new president. Where does the Democratic Party stand? How do they oppose these plans by Donald Trump, particularly when it gets to these cabinet confirmations? And so I think, to your point, Mara, you saw today, these senators were all over the map. So I think if we cannot figure out a unified message against Donald Trump, the Democrats are going to have a hard time putting together a message in 2 years when it's time to re-elect Congress.
We were talking earlier in the show about this freeze or somewhat freeze of federal programs in terms of just spending. When you talk to voters, when you talk to candidates, you've worked with a lot of them over the years, does this break through as an issue? Because Democrats are saying they are getting concerns, but do you find Republicans are a little bit on edge now about some of these executive orders, especially when it comes to federal programs in their communities?
I think the issue here is the chaos that it created and the confusion and members not even being aware of what was going on. And if anything, people on Capitol Hill like to be, especially members of Congress, they want to be informed. Yep. They want to know before they're asked a question by reporters of what's going on, and they want to be included in what the plan is. And that disconnect was a real error by the White House staff by not briefing members and by not having a conversation and explaining it. They can cite all they want that it's the media's fault for why there was confusion, but in reality, members themselves were confused. And I do think that by and large, Republicans' issue, it has been from previous cycles and in the House as well, is this concern about can they govern? And if they can't get themselves together, they're going to have a problem.
Yeah. What about the federal workers? You almost see the Republicans baiting Democrats to become the party of the federal worker. The Republicans are being out front in that they want to shrink the federal workforce. They're offering people these buyouts or whatever you want to call them. It depends on whom you ask, but some way to get people to leave the federal workforce.
Look, I think President Trump is really great at politics, and I think he has done a great job over the last 8 years proving that. But over the last 8 days, he has not been good at politics. When you think about having the confusion of your core electorate questioning if they're going to get their checks, their Social Security checks, their Medicaid checks, all of that, on top of eggs going up this week, on top of gas prices going up this week, on top of all of these things that are going to be really directly impactful to people's lives, politics are bad. So I think President Trump and his team have got to figure out a way to kind of do the promises kept, promises made on the immigration front, on the other front for security, but they've really got to figure out a way to talk about economic issues. We're almost in the place where we were with Joe Biden just a couple months ago when they're telling us that things are getting better while they hide their hand and throw the stones at other things. And so until President Trump figures out how to get prices down, which is going to be very hard, we know that, it's almost impossible, he's in a politically fraught place, I think.
And what about President Trump? You see him flexing his executive power. And everyone in Washington, Democrat and Republican, seems to just kind of be accepting it for now. Is it bewilderment that's eventually going to lead to a little bit more reaction?
I actually think the most interesting thing is that his first bill, which was signed today, was a bipartisan bill. Yep. I mean, I think a lot of people went into this assuming Donald Trump was going to do a lot of executive orders and kind of run things however he felt he wanted to. But the fact that the first bill that he is signing today is a bipartisan measure, a campaign promise fulfilled about addressing an immigration order, he gets a little bit more credit for having done that. And I do think that at least the House side is going to step in right line behind him. There will be some more issues coming down the pipeline for Congress in general when it comes to the Senate. There'll be more of a backstop there to address the issues. But by and large, I do think that Trump has delivered on that promise, and they're kind of letting him have the run of the show, basically.
Yeah. What's interesting, though, is that you did see bipartisan support for Laken Riley and that legislation. But how are Democrats going to handle all of this footage that keeps coming out hour by hour of ICE and DHS having these deportations, having military flights, bringing undocumented migrants back to their respective countries? So they're working with the president on some immigration issues. But you do hear many Democrats are alarmed about what's happening. Is there a strategy?
Well, I don't think there's a strategy yet, Bob. I do think Democrats have got to be careful not to over-index. I think it's very clear with this past election that most Americans want to look at safety. They want this border to be safe, to feel safe, to have perception of safety. And so I think if you get into the way of that, that's going to hamper your politics in 2 years. However, the thing I'm most concerned about is the mayors and governors. So Democratic governors, Democratic mayors. You saw J.B. Pritzker just this week, the mayor of Chicago, Brandon Johnson, who is in a fraught position himself. And then you look at L.A. and other places. And so I think the mayors and the governors have got to figure out a way to both serve their citizens and also not over-index on protecting illegal immigrants, because that's not the issue of the moment. I think most Americans want to get as many illegal immigrants out of the country. And so I don't know what the strategy is going to be yet, but I do think you have to balance those two things, and the governors and the mayors are going to be the most important, even beyond Congress, for that.
So two sharp political minds. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., at this point, still a lot to be done. Does he get confirmed?
With Democratic support, I think he does. I know there are a lot of people who have questions about, we talked before about the role that Bill Cassidy will play in that support, and that's going to be a big decision for him to come being chairman of the Help Committee on the Senate side. It's going to be huge.
So Senator Cassidy, the one to watch for the Republicans, and will he get confirmed? Will he get some Democratic support?
I think he missed an opportunity with Senator Cassidy, my senator from Louisiana today. I think he should have been a lot more prepared for that question.
Yeah.
Haima Moore, Maura Gillespie, thank you for stopping by for our political chat. Democratic Party, as we've been discussing, trying to navigate this Trump second term. How the pick in this weekend's vote for party chair could help steer the ship. We'll hear from the outgoing head of the DNC coming up next on America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. The Democratic National Committee will elect a new chair on Saturday. Our colleague Ed O'Keefe spoke with the outgoing head of the DNC, Jamie Harrison, about then-President Biden dropping out of the 2024 race and about the future of the party.
You know the lay of the party pretty well, and you know all the players.
I try to.
Yeah, it's your job to know. There were 3 or 4 people who would have done it if there either been more time or if there'd been some kind of pop-up primary system established.
Well, what we established is we followed the rules, which basically said if you don't have a nominee, right, then it's the delegates of the DNC, of the convention, who will determine. And so that day, Ed, that Joe Biden dropped out, I called a few of the folks who I thought could possibly be a part of the process. People who had expressed some interest down the road for running.
Handful of governors?
And to a handful of governors. And to a person, every single one of them said, I'm not going to run, I'm supporting Kamala Harris. And it was almost like I was chasing the Kamala Harris calls, because they all said, I just talked to the VP and I have pledged my support to her. So people made a decision not to run. Had they run, the rules we set up a process where they could have gone out and secured the signatures from a certain number of delegates, and they would have been on the ballot, and we would have gotten it all done before that Ohio deadline, which was the first part of August. So there was a process. People made a decision not to participate in that process, and Kamala Harris, because she did the work, was a winner.
You think elements of your party too focused on being perfect and not focused on winning?
There are moments in which I do feel that there are folks who are looking. What's the saying about the good and the perfect? I always mess it up, but I feel that there's some folks who
don't let perfect be the enemy of the good.
Yeah, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. I think there's some folks who do fall in that trap sometimes. If you do not fit into, you check these certain bucket items, then you're cast out or you're put on the bench or the back burner. We are a diverse party. This is a diverse country. We come to this from different perspectives, and we're not always going to agree on everything. I love my wife more than life itself, and I can tell you we don't agree on every single thing. I'm sure you and your wife don't agree on every single thing, right? And so that doesn't mean then you discard and say, oh, I'm taking my ball and I'm going home, or I can't talk to you anymore. No, you take the time to work it out, because there is some commonality there, and you build from the commonality up. And I hope more of our folks get to understand that. You got to be more elastic than rigid. And sometimes we got folks that are very rigid. If you don't have the right job, if you didn't come from the right community, if you don't say the right word, and then therefore you are X'd out or you're castigated. I do believe we need to pause on that. Let's be a big tent and let's be an open tent and embrace more diversity in terms of thought.
So looking ahead,
yeah,
should Kamala Harris run again?
If she wants to.
You think she could win?
I believe she can. I mean, if I didn't believe Kamala Harris could win, I wouldn't have worked as hard as I did to help her win this last time around. You know, Donald Trump, and when you look at politics, Donald Trump and Barack Obama are just enigmas in politics. I think they do something different to the electorate every time they run that you can't counter. But then when they are not on the ballots, it's almost like you go back to the political gravity pulls people right back into it. That's part of how we won with how well we did in the midterms.
So you're saying Donald Trump was unbeatable?
No, not he was. Joe Biden figured out how to, right? But, you know, Kamala Harris could have used more time and other things. But in the end of the day, Trump won't be on the ballot. He's a lame duck now. And so the question is, who will be on the ballot for the Republicans and who will be on the ballot for the Democrats? And how will the Republicans play their hand over the course of the next 4 years? And looking at how they played the hand so far, that's why I'm very confident that Democrats will take back the House in 26.
You've got a race to succeed you on Saturday. Who should replace you as DNC chair?
Well, I will let the members of the DNC determine that. But the one thing that we're going to hand over a strong Democratic Party. I've been in this building now for 8 years. 4 years as associate chair under Tom Perez, and then 4 years as DNC chair. When I think back to the DNC, when we walked in this door in 2017, this place is much stronger than what it was at that point in time. The data and the tech investments that we made under my chairmanship, you know, people talk about Howard Dean and the 50-state strategy. We've had 50-state strategy on steroids because we've invested more money into state parties than any time in the history of the DNC. 176 years, no DNC has ever invested this amount of resources. And now we have set a new floor for what the next DNC has to do.
A lot of people around you, Congressman Clyburn, some of your associates here, have endorsed Ken Martin. Why not just endorse Ken Martin?
Because
wouldn't he be the best continuation of?
I said at the very beginning, Ken is a dear friend of mine, and I think he would be one hell of a chair. But there are a lot of good candidates who I think he would do a really good job as chair as well. I said when I started this process that I was not going to publicly endorse and do that, and I'm going to continue that.
Good to hear from Ed O'Keefe and the outgoing chair there, Jamie Harrison. Two candidates endorsed by President Trump have now won special primaries in Florida to replace former Congressman Matt Gaetz and former Congressman Mike Waltz. The state's chief financial officer, Jimmy Petronis, will advance in the race for Gaetz's former House seat. And in the 6th congressional district, State Senator Randy Fine won the GOP nomination. Republicans are expected to hold these seats in the general election on April 1st. This would boost the GOP's razor-thin majority in the U.S. House. President Trump offers federal workers buyouts, as we've discussed, to resign. But is the move to cut the federal workforce legal? We'll break it down coming up next on America Decides.
Boy, it's just going to be a gravy train. You're just going to get paid for 7 months without working. The president has no authority to make that offer.
Virginia Democrat Senator Tim Kaine there pushing back against the Trump administration's offer to around 2 million federal workers to resign and be paid through September. Let's bring in Catherine Watson, a politics reporter for CBS News Digital. Catherine, great to have you here.
Thanks for being
What's
here.
your latest reporting tell you about this offer and whether it's actually going to be entertained by some federal workers?
Yeah, well, basically, federal workers got this email that they were completely not expecting, not only telling them to be back in the office 5 days a week, but saying that if they didn't want to do that, they could go ahead and simply defer their resignation. They would need to make a decision by February 6th as to whether they wanted to resign. They were told all they needed to do was simply reply to an email with the word resign. and it would become effective September 30th, that they would basically be able to receive pay and seemingly not work at most federal agencies. That obviously sparked a lot of confusion. There weren't really any clarifications as to the details of this offer. So that's something that federal agencies have been scrambling to get, that federal employees have been scrambling to get. But it's definitely created a lot of confusion. And I've spoken to some federal employment attorneys and that kind of thing to try to get some of these details sorted out.
So, Catherine, when you spoke to those attorneys, what are some of the legal questions being raised about this proposal?
Yeah, well, as you heard Tim Kaine mention, it's really unclear as to whether the president, whether the White House, whether OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, can make this offer in the first place. But then, of course, there are concerns over whether federal employees will be guaranteed to get that money, right? It really isn't spelled out what kind of protections there are. Say a federal employee goes ahead and decides to submit their deferred resignation, if you will. It's really unclear as to whether they have protections to make sure they get paid. It's also a little unclear as to whether they can go back on that resignation if they do decide to offer it. So a lot of questions that are really unanswered here. Basically, one of the federal employment attorneys I spoke with today said, this really puts federal employees in a precarious situation, although this particular attorney said they understand that these federal workers don't know if they're going to have a job in 6 months, if it could be eliminated. So this offer is, potentially something to think about as well.
So what's the Trump administration's motivation here based on your reporting? Is it about trying to shrink the federal workforce by the end of the year? Is it part of a broader ideological project?
Yeah, certainly. Well, this is, if you will, kind of part of the return to work order that the president is instituting, that the federal government is instituting. But the White House has been really clear. They haven't shied away from the reality that they are trying to cut costs, that they are trying to shrink the size of the federal workforce. And they see this as just a really effective way to do it. If I can add to that, we have sourcing at CBS News that up to maybe 10% is kind of the estimate of federal employees might go ahead and do this deferred resignation. Of course, we're going to see what those numbers look like if this policy really does go through. And that's something agencies have been told to track, is how many employees are submitting these deferred resignations.
It certainly caused a stir. Just traveling around Northern Virginia in recent days on some stories, you can just hear from federal employees all of this concern about these new rules and these new proposals. It's disruptive, to say the least, for some of them. Appreciate your reporting. Catherine Watson, come back soon. We will see you again with, I'm sure, a lot more to report on these executive orders. But for now, we end tonight's program looking back at what happened in political history on this day 23 years ago. On January 29th, 2002, President George W. Bush was on Capitol Hill for his State of the Union address. It was just months after the September 11th attacks, and his speech outlined the war on terror. President George W. Bush famously said then, this is about Iran, Iraq, and North Korea.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world. By seeking weapons of mass destruction, these regimes pose a grave and growing danger.
14 months later, the United States invaded Iraq. As we now know, this was a highly controversial decision by George W. Bush over the issue of weapons of mass destruction and how that decision was made to go into war. That does it for us, though, today. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report starts right now.